Ever left a family gathering early just to protect your peace?
My brother looked straight at me across the room and told me I should probably skip Easter dinner this year because, in his exact words, we're celebrating winners only. The words came out of his mouth so casually, as if it were the most natural thing to say, and everyone else laughed nervously like it was just a harmless jab. But in that moment, I felt something shift inside me. Not because his insult hurt in the way he intended, but because I suddenly realized how deep his arrogance had grown and how blind he was to the truth of who had been quietly holding his family together for years. I smiled, and I didn't argue, because arguing with Mark was always a waste of breath. He thrived on the back and forth, on proving that he could talk louder, sharper, and more cruelly than anyone else in the room. Instead, I tucked the comment away, like slipping a card up my sleeve in a game that wasn't over yet, and I thought, all right, let's see how you celebrate without me. It's strange, the way families work. You grow up in the same house, you eat the same dinners, you share the same holidays, but somehow roles are assigned early on, and once they stick, they seem impossible to shake. My role, as far back as I can remember, was the dependable one, the one who stayed quiet, did the extra chores, kept my head down, and learned to survive by being useful rather than flashy. Mark's role was the opposite. He was the golden boy, the one who always had an audience, who got praised for trying even when he failed, and who managed to convince everyone that his confidence equaled competence. I used to think it was just sibling dynamics, the usual imbalance every family has, but as adults it only got worse, because now the stakes weren't just about who got the bigger slice of cake, it was about money, careers, reputation, and the image of who mattered more. For years, I told myself it didn't matter. I had my own path, and I didn't need anyone else's validation. But when his kids were born, something in me softened. They didn't ask to have a father like Mark or to grow up in a household where pride mattered more than planning. I watched him and his wife overspend, buy flashy things, and then complain that saving for college was impossible with today's economy. I stepped in, quietly, setting up an account and covering the contributions because I believed those kids deserved better and because I didn't want to see their futures sabotaged by their parents' short-sightedness. I never told anyone. I never asked for recognition. I just did it month after month while listening to Mark boast about his latest bonuses, his vacations, his sacrifices for the family. He never suspected the safety net under his children was actually mine. So when he looked me in the eye and called me a loser, it was almost laughable. He had no idea that his so-called winning streak was only possible because I'd been standing behind him, holding up the stage he strutted across like it was his birthright. I could have said it right then. I could have cut him down in front of everyone, but I didn't, because anger wasn't what I felt in that moment, it was clarity. For the first time, I saw exactly how to take back the power I had been giving away for years, and the best part was that I wouldn't need to scream, argue, or make a scene. All it would take was silence and one decision. I smiled, I excused myself earlier than usual, and I drove home in complete calm. My phone buzzed with family messages about the food, the pictures, the jokes I had missed after I left, but I didn't respond. I sat down, pulled up the paperwork I had filed years ago, and I stared at the line that showed the automatic contributions to the college fund. Every month, like clockwork, I had been the invisible provider. I thought about the years I had sacrificed small luxuries for myself so that his kids wouldn't have to worry. I thought about the pride in his voice when he told people he was a planner, a responsible father. I thought about how quick he had been to dismiss me as unworthy of sitting at the same table. The funny thing about being underestimated is that people don't notice when you finally stop carrying them. They think the floor beneath them is solid because it always has been. They don't realize until it's gone that you were the one holding it up. And that night, I knew exactly what I was going to do. I closed my laptop without making the change yet because I wanted to let the idea sit in my chest for a moment longer. The choice was mine, and mine alone. If I wanted to keep being the silent supporter, I could. If I wanted to stop, everything he built his bragging rights on would crumble. He didn't know it, but I had the power to decide what his winning looked like. And as I lay in bed, his words replayed in my head, "We're celebrating winners only." I laughed to myself, not out of bitterness, but out of certainty, because he was about to learn the difference between pretending to win and actually earning it. The next move was mine. The morning after that Easter remark, I made coffee the way I always do and sat with the quiet, not because I needed to lick my wounds, but because I wanted to look straight at the pattern I had been repeating for years. The pattern where I solved problems before anyone else felt them, and then pretended that nothing extraordinary had happened. And as I opened the folder with the account statements, I could almost hear Mark's voice narrating his own story of grit and sacrifice, while the actual numbers, written in my name and leaving my bank every single month, told a very different story about who had been carrying whom. I remembered how the whole thing started, how Kelly cried on the phone one night about daycare and rent, and how hard it was to breathe when every bill felt like a cliff edge, and how I told her that the kids should not have to pay for the chaos of two adults who loved appearances more than planning, and I set up the education plan quietly, with me as the owner and the kids as beneficiaries. Automatic transfers scheduled for the same day each month, because I knew my own tendencies and I trusted a routine more than I trusted inspiration, and I told nobody because it felt cleaner to keep gratitude and leverage out of it. Which in hindsight is almost funny, because the absence of leverage became the very thing that allowed Mark to treat me like furniture in the house he imagined he built alone. There is a kind of power that only becomes visible when you stop using it, a power that hides inside the steady hum of things going right, and as I scrolled through the contributions, month after month, like a metronome, I realized that my quiet had been the scaffolding for his swagger, that my reliability gave him room to play responsible father in public while privately living like the bills would always sort themselves out, and the realization did not make me angry. It made me deliberate. Because now I understood that I could make one small change and the entire performance would slip. I called the institution and, after the usual security dance, I asked the representative about pausing contributions, and her voice was careful and neutral the way people are when they sense they are standing near family drama, and she explained that yes, I could pause or cancel at any time since the account was under my control, and she asked if I wanted to schedule the change for next month or stop immediately, and I heard myself ask for the pause to begin before the next withdrawal so that there would be a clean break with no partial drafts or messy reversals, because even in this I wanted to be precise and undeniable. When I hung up, I felt a kind of steadiness that I wish I could have bottled and handed to my younger self, the one who kept trying to earn love by making problems disappear. Because in that moment I understood that kindness without boundaries becomes a script other people write for you, and I was finally taking the pen back, not to write a revenge fantasy where I shouted from the rooftops, but to craft a quiet correction where reality and responsibility found their rightful owners. I drafted a simple email to myself with the confirmation number and the note that contributions were paused indefinitely, and then I opened a spreadsheet where I had been tracking the transfers, a habit I kept more out of comfort than suspicion. And I highlighted the next date in a calm color because I wanted to watch that moment arrive, the moment when the money would not leave my account and the hole would suddenly appear in Mark's carefully edited story about how he always takes care of his own. It made me think about the family mythology, how our parents praised him for big gestures and praised me for being low maintenance, and how flattery can be just another way to assign labor. Because the golden child gets applause while the dependable child gets the bill, and I realized that the only person who could end that arrangement was me, since the stagehands never get an intermission unless they put the lights down themselves. I also thought about the kids, and I want to be honest about that because I am not made of stone. I thought about their faces and their plans and the way they talk about campuses like they are maps to a life they cannot wait to start. And I sat with the question of whether stopping the contributions would punish them more than it would teach their parents anything. But then I remembered that I am not the only adult in the story and that there are countless families who make school work with less bragging and more honesty, and I decided that I would not keep enabling parents who weaponize my generosity while calling me a loser to my face. I kept my mouth shut in the family chat when Mark posted about a sudden car repair and Kelly chimed in about how some months are just tougher than others and how they wish certain people would be more supportive. And I said nothing because the point was not to win an argument, but to let reality walk into their house without me serving as its chaperone. In the afternoon, I checked the account again, not because I doubted the pause, but because I wanted to watch myself stand by my decision, and then I closed everything and went for a long drive with the radio low. Not to escape, but to settle into the feeling that I had finally stepped out of a costume that never fit, and I decided that if anyone asked me for help again, I would not lie or pretend. I would simply say that I have adjusted my priorities and that I trust them to handle their responsibilities the way adults do when there is no invisible ant cleaning up the mess. A week later, a message popped up in the family thread about tuition deadlines coming up faster than expected and about how unexpected expenses had collided with the calendar, which was an elegant way of saying that the old gravity had changed and things were dropping harder than usual. And even then I stayed quiet, because silence was not a retreat, it was the strategy that let the truth do its work without me needing to perform. And as the calendar edged toward the date that used to trigger my transfer like clockwork, I could feel the air tightening in their house even from a distance, that brittle quality people get when the performance starts to crack. And I waited with a calm I had earned the hard way, because the next move was already baked into the schedule, and when the day arrived and nothing left my account, I knew the first domino had fallen, and the sound it made in their living room would be louder than anything I could ever say. When the first missed contribution came and went, I thought there might be a delay before anyone noticed, because I had learned from experience that Mark and Kelly only paid attention when something shouted at them, and quiet numbers in a spreadsheet rarely shouted. But within a week the family group chat began to pick up a different tone, one of subtle strain covered in thin layers of humor, the kind of jokes people make when they are not really laughing, but want to test whether someone else will join in and confirm that everything is fine. Mark posted a picture of his car in the shop, captioned with a sarcastic line about how nothing says responsible adulthood like dropping a fortune on tires the week tuition bills are due, and Kelly added a reply about how life has a way of sorting itself out when everyone contributes fairly, which I read twice, because the words were almost innocent to someone outside the family, but, to me, they carried a pointed edge. The kind of edge you aim at the sibling you have labeled as less successful, even when that sibling has been underwriting the very life you parade as successful. I stared at the screen and considered replying, maybe with a question about how their emergency fund was holding up, or how the budgeting seminars Mark always mocked might come in handy, but then I decided silence would cut sharper than sarcasm. Because silence lets people hear their own echoes, and their echoes were starting to sound desperate. At a Sunday dinner I did attend, one of their kids, sweet, polite, always careful with words, brought up the subject of financial aid in a nervous, roundabout way, as if fishing for reassurance without wanting to sound ungrateful. And it took everything in me not to blurt out that the reason they had been able to dream so freely about big-name universities was because I had been setting aside money quietly for years. But I held my tongue and instead listened as Mark puffed his chest and explained to the table that he and Kelly had always planned ahead, that they never relied on handouts, that winners make things happen while others just watch. My father nodded approvingly, my mother smiled as if proud, and I felt the urge to laugh, not because it was funny, but because hypocrisy so thick can almost choke a room. The following week, another message appeared in the group chat, this time from Kelly, less veiled and more obviously directed at me, where she wrote about how some families understand the meaning of solidarity and some people only take while pretending to care. And she signed it with a heart emoji to make it look playful, but I knew what she meant, and I knew Mark had probably been pacing around the kitchen dictating the line to her like it was a campaign slogan. Again, I said nothing, because every response would have given them the chance to paint me as defensive. And I wanted them to squirm not because I attacked, but because the safety net had vanished and they were only just realizing they had been walking a tightrope without balance. At work, while answering emails, I would catch myself wondering how many days it would take before the tuition office sent its first reminder, how many nights Kelly would lie awake doing the math and coming up short, and how many times Mark would replay my smile from Easter, misreading it as surrender when it was in fact the seed of his undoing. I pictured the moment when their children, completely innocent in this, would overhear them fighting and piece together that the image of stability had been nothing more than borrowed scaffolding, and while part of me ached for them, Another part reminded me that enabling adults by shielding them from consequences is not kindness, but complicity. A family dinner was scheduled at my parents' house, and I knew the subject would come up, because by then the tuition bill must have landed and the silence in the group chat had grown heavier, like a storm about to break. I arrived early, not to help set the table but to brace myself, and as soon as the plates were down, Mark began talking louder than necessary about how unpredictable life can be, about how institutions never understand what real families go through, and about how disappointing it is when people you think will step up actually disappear. My mother looked puzzled, my father frowned as if searching for context, and I kept my face calm, sipping water and letting the moment stretch, because I knew they were circling the subject, but not yet ready to say outright what had happened. As the meal went on, the tension built, with Kelly finally dropping a line about how some people seem to believe that family obligations are optional, and she looked at me just long enough to test whether I would bite, but I only smiled, the same smile I wore at Easter. And I asked politely for the salt as though nothing heavier than mashed potatoes was on the table. The silence that followed my request was so sharp I thought for a second someone might call me out directly, but they didn't, because naming the truth would mean admitting it, and they were not ready for that yet. Driving home, I thought about how cracks form slowly, invisible until suddenly a wall shifts, and I realized the wall was already leaning, and one more push would bring it down. I knew the confrontation was inevitable, and that the next family gathering might not end with polite smiles and dessert, but with someone demanding answers in a tone they would regret. And as I pulled into my driveway, I caught myself smiling again, not out of malice, but out of certainty, because the cracks had started to show, and soon the entire performance would collapse under its own weight, with me standing quietly on the sidelines, the one person who knew exactly why the ground was finally giving way. When the next family dinner rolled around, I could already feel the tension before I even walked through the door. Because the silence that had hung in the group chat for days was not the silence of peace, but the silence of people rehearsing what they wanted to say without daring to type it out. And I knew that sitting at the same table was going to push their discomfort into the open whether I played along or not. I arrived with the same calm expression I had carried since Easter, not because I wanted to provoke them, but because I had nothing left to defend. And there is a strange kind of freedom in realizing that the very people who once dictated how you were supposed to feel no longer hold that power when you simply stop reacting. The dinner began like most do in our family, with half-hearted small talk and forced cheerfulness layered over an undercurrent that everyone felt but nobody named, and as soon as we sat down, Mark launched into a speech about the importance of accountability, talking loudly about how life tests people and how you can tell who really loves you by who shows up when things get tough, and the way he kept glancing around the table made it obvious he was baiting me to respond, as though he needed me to rise to the challenge so that he could cast himself as the victim of my supposed betrayal. My mother looked puzzled, my father's eyebrows knit together in a quiet frown, and my cousins shifted uncomfortably, clearly sensing that something ugly was brewing underneath the surface of what was supposed to be just another family meal. Kelly jumped in next, her voice sharper than usual, saying that some people take pride in pretending to be self-sufficient when in reality they've been leaning on others for years, and I had to bite my tongue to stop myself from laughing. Because the irony of her saying that in front of me, the one person who had literally funded their children's future while they bragged about their independence, was almost too rich to ignore. She went on about how disappointing it is when people you count on suddenly vanish, how selfishness reveals itself in times of pressure, and she aimed her words at me like darts while pretending she was speaking generally, and the rest of the table sat frozen, waiting for me to either fight back or crumble under the weight of her insinuations. Instead, I leaned back in my chair, let a small smile tug at the corners of my mouth, and stayed completely silent, because I realized in that moment that nothing I could say would expose them as thoroughly as their own panic was already doing. The air stretched thin with the quiet I created, until finally my father asked the question that neither of them wanted to hear. Wait, who has actually been paying into that college fund all these years? The words landed with a thud in the center of the table, and you could see Mark's face falter for just a second before he pulled himself together and tried to laugh it off, saying something vague about financial planning and teamwork. But the hesitation was enough for my mother to turn her eyes toward me with a confusion that begged for confirmation. I still didn't speak. I didn't need to. The silence did the work for me, because the longer I said nothing, the more everyone else began to realize that the story they had been told was not the whole truth. My father pressed again, asking whether it was really Mark who had been funding the account, and Mark's cheeks flushed as he stumbled through another half-answer, insisting that of course he provided for his kids, though he quickly pivoted to blaming unexpected setbacks for why things had suddenly become difficult. The problem was that the mask had already slipped, and everyone at the table could see it, even if they didn't know the full extent of what had just been revealed. I glanced down at my plate, took a slow sip of water, and simply let the silence settle, and in that silence my power grew louder than any accusation I could have made, because in their desperation to maintain the illusion of control, Mark and Kelly had already exposed themselves as hypocrites. My cousins exchanged awkward glances. My mother looked like she was piecing together a puzzle she had never realized existed. And Mark's voice grew more defensive by the second as he tried to fill the quiet I left behind with explanations that nobody had asked for. When dessert was served, the conversation had fractured into uneven fragments, with some people trying to change the subject and others too distracted to care, and I sat there watching Mark fidget with his fork, his jaw tight, his eyes darting toward me with a kind of simmering anger that told me he had finally understood what my silence meant. He knew now that I wasn't going to shield him anymore, that I wasn't going to step in and keep his story intact, and that knowledge burned him far worse than any confrontation ever could have. As we left the table and everyone said their polite goodbyes, he avoided eye contact, but I could feel the storm brewing in his chest, the storm of a man who had lived his whole life being treated as the winner. Now forced to recognize that the floor under him was cracking because the sister he mocked had quietly stepped aside. And as I walked out the door, still silent, still calm, I knew that it was only a matter of time before that storm erupted, because he could not stand the thought of losing control of the narrative, and the next time I saw him, it would not be in the company of relatives who could soften the blow. It would be face-to-face, unfiltered, and ugly. Driving home that night, I thought about how revealing the truth sometimes requires no grand speech, no carefully crafted revenge plan, but simply the patience to let people unravel under the weight of their own lies. And I smiled at the thought that Mark's unraveling had only just begun, because the performance he had curated for years was crumbling, and he knew that I was the one person who could end it completely with just a word, yet I had chosen silence, which was so much worse for him, because silence left him trapped in the mirror of his own guilt. I had known from the moment I saw the look in his eyes at that family dinner that Mark would not be able to let things sit in silence for long, because silence was the one weapon he had never learned how to fight, and so when the knock came on my door a few days later, hard and impatient, I was not surprised in the least, though I did take a moment to steady myself before opening it, because I knew that once the words began to spill from his mouth there would be no pause, no breath, just a storm of accusations meant to drown me in guilt and force me back into the role I had finally stepped out of. He stood on my porch red-faced, his hands moving in angry circles, his voice already raised before I even had the chance to say hello, shouting about how I had ruined everything, how his kid's future was now in jeopardy, how I had betrayed not just him but the entire family, as though my refusal to keep carrying his burden was some kind of moral crime rather than the simple correction of years of imbalance. He accused me of jealousy, of bitterness, of wanting to see him fail, and he threw every insult he could think of in my direction, hoping that one would stick and force me to back down the way I always had when we were younger. But I stood in the doorway calm and steady, letting his words crash around me without reaching me, because I knew that the truth was not on his side anymore, and that no amount of shouting could undo the fact that the stage he had built his image upon had been held up by my quiet labor I had finally withdrawn. I watched as his anger twisted into desperation, because beneath all the insults was the real fear that people were beginning to see him without the mask, and what he feared most was not losing the money, but losing the story he had told about himself for so long. When he paused for just a second to catch his breath, I looked him straight in the eye and told him the one line that had been sitting on my tongue since Easter. You told me I wasn't a winner, so I stopped paying for your victory parade. The words landed heavier than I expected, not because they were cruel, but because they stripped away the last layer of denial he had left, and for the first time in our lives, I saw him without the armor of arrogance. Just a man who realized too late that the ground beneath him had been borrowed. He sputtered, tried to regain momentum, but the sentence had already cut through the noise, and there was no way for him to spin it without admitting everything he had spent years denying. The neighbors began to notice a curtain shifting here, a door opening across the street, and suddenly his tantrum was not private anymore. It was public, and every raised word, every wild gesture, became part of the spectacle he had created, exposing him not as the successful, confident brother he always pretended to be, but as a man undone by the truth that his life had been propped up by the sister he dismissed. He shouted that I had humiliated him, that I had destroyed his family, that I had crossed a line I could never uncross, but I did not respond with more words, because I had already said everything that needed to be said, and anything further would have only diluted the sharpness of that single revelation. I let him rant until his voice cracked and his arms dropped to his sides, and then, without raising my voice, I told him that I no longer owed him an explanation, that I had done more than enough for years while being treated like less, and that he could either take responsibility for his own life or watch it crumble, but either way I was done cleaning up the mess. His face twisted with rage one last time, but I had already stepped back inside and closed the door, letting the wood and the lock separate me from the chaos on the porch, and in that moment, I felt something I had not felt in years, a clean, unshakable freedom that came from finally refusing to play the role he had written for me. I leaned against the door and listened as his footsteps retreated, heavy and uneven, and I imagined the look on his face as he realized that screaming had not restored his control, that guilt had not bent me back into submission, and that for the first time in his life, he had to stand alone without the invisible safety net he had mocked. The quiet in my house felt almost sacred, not because it was peaceful, but because it was mine, earned through years of silence that had finally turned into strength. I thought about the kids again, and I knew they would figure out a way forward because they were smart and capable, and maybe, just maybe, this would be the moment when they began to see through the stories their father told and realize the truth about what it really means to stand on your own. And as I sat down in my living room, letting the adrenaline drain from my body, I smiled, not the polite, weary smile I had worn for years, but a smile born of knowing that I had finally taken back what was mine, that I had ended the game on my terms, and that no matter what he told the family or the neighbors or even himself, the truth had already been revealed in a way that could never be hidden again. My brother had tried to cast me as the loser in his story, but in the end, it was his own arrogance that had lost him everything, and I walked away not only free but triumphant, because I had shown him that the quiet one, the dependable one, the one he dismissed without thought, was the very person who had always held the power, and once I decided to use it, he never stood a chance.